In the heart of the Black Forest lies the Mummelsee, a dark lake where young girls mysteriously disappear. Legend says a king beneath the waters lures his victims into an underwater kingdom. When two siblings stumble upon the lake's deadly secret, they're thrust into a fight for survival. Will they escape the lake's curse, or will they vanish like so many before them? Welcome to Premier Tales. Klaus and his sister Lena were visiting the Black Forest, a place famous for its dark trees and spooky stories. One day, their parents took them to Mummelsee, a strange lake up high in the mountains. The water was dark and still, almost like a giant mirror. The trees around it were so thick that sunlight couldn't get through, making the place feel eerie and mysterious. Their parents warned them not to get too close to the water, but Klaus and Lena couldn't resist exploring. The air felt damp and cold, and all they could hear was the sound of birds in the distance. Lena stepped closer to the edge of the lake, but Klaus had a strange feeling in his gut, like something wasn't quite right. He couldn't shake the thought that something was watching them. That night, they stayed at a small inn by the lake. The innkeeper, an old man with wrinkles all over his face, noticed them talking about the lake. He gave them a serious look and said, "You kids don't know the danger of Mummelsee. Many years ago, a king lived under the water. He could call young girls to him with his voice. He would charm them into swimming, but once they did, they would disappear forever." Klaus chuckled nervously. "It's just a story," he said, but the old man's face didn't change. "It's no joke. If you hear the singing at night, don't go near the water. The king is still there, waiting to take more people." Lena was quiet and looked worried. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the old man's warning. Later that night, while everyone else was asleep, Lena couldn't get any rest. She kept hearing a soft, beautiful song outside her window. At first, it was very quiet, like someone was singing far away, but then it got louder. The sound was so lovely that she felt drawn to it. She quietly got out of bed, curious to see where it was coming from. She looked out the window and saw a figure standing at the edge of the lake. The moonlight made the figure hard to see, but Lena could feel something pulling her toward it. The song sounded even more beautiful as she watched. Before she knew it, Lena had started to step outside. Klaus suddenly ran into the room, pulling her back. "Lena, what are you doing?" he asked. She looked at him with confusion. "I was just listening," she said. But Klaus could tell that something was wrong. He didn't know what, but he felt the danger too. The next morning, Lena was acting strange. She barely spoke and seemed lost in thought. Klaus was worried but didn't know how to help her. That afternoon, they went back to the lake. The sun was high, but the water still looked dark and cold. Lena walked slowly to the edge, her steps heavy, as if something was pulling her down. Klaus called out to her, but she didn't answer. Then out of nowhere, a cold hand shot up from the lake, grabbing Lena's arm. She screamed, and Klaus rushed forward, pulling her away from the water. The hand disappeared, leaving only ripples behind. Lena looked pale and whispered, "He's calling me." Klaus felt his heart race. The old man's story didn't seem so silly now. Lena's strange behavior only got worse after that day. She would sit by the lake for hours, staring at the water as if she could see something that Klaus couldn't. Her eyes were different, darker, as if she wasn't really there. One evening, Klaus noticed something that terrified him. He saw two glowing eyes just below the surface of the water, staring at him. They didn't blink, and it felt like the lake was watching him. Just then, Lena spoke in a cold, empty voice. "He's waiting for me," she said. Klaus tried to shake her out of it, but she just stared at the water, her eyes blank. He realized the old man's warnings were true. Something was controlling her, and it wasn't going to let her go easily. Klaus went to find Wilfried, a fisherman who lived near the lake. Wilfried had been around the area for years and had heard all the old stories about the Water King. When Klaus asked him about Lena, Wilfried looked serious. "The Water King is real," he said. "I've seen him. He took my daughter a long time ago. She was just like Lena, charmed by his voice. If you care about her, you need to get her away from the lake. He won't let go easily." Klaus was scared but didn't know what to do. "What can I do to help her?" he asked. Wilfried gave him a hard look. "You need to find the flower that grows near the lake. It's the only thing that can break his hold on her, but you have to get it before the full moon." Klaus didn't know if he could trust Wilfried, but it was the only clue he had. He decided to try. That evening, Klaus went to the lake by himself. The wind was cold, and the water was so still it almost seemed unnatural. He stood at the edge, calling out to the lake. "Leave her alone, she's mine!" he shouted, but all he heard was the same haunting song. Suddenly, a figure appeared, rising from the water. The figure was a woman, but her face was hidden in shadows. Her voice was soft and sweet. "Come with me," she whispered. "The king is waiting for you." Klaus backed away, terrified. "No!" he shouted, but the woman only smiled and vanished into the water. He knew now that the lake was trying to take him too. The next day, Wilfried told Klaus about the flower. "It's near the water's edge," he said. "You must find it before the full moon, or it'll be too late." Klaus didn't waste any time. He ran to the lake that night, hoping to find the flower in time. The moon was bright, and everything around him seemed still. Suddenly, he saw a glow by the water. There it was, the flower shining in the moonlight. Klaus picked it up, hoping it would help. When Klaus returned with the flower, Lena was standing at the water's edge again. "What are you doing here?" Klaus asked, his voice shaking. But Lena just stared at him with strange, empty eyes. "He's waiting," she said, as if she didn't even recognize him. Klaus felt a wave of panic. He pressed the flower into her hands. As soon as it touched her skin, she screamed. Her body twisted, and Klaus had to hold on to her tightly to stop her from falling into the water. For a moment, it seemed like the flower might work. But just then, the lake rippled violently and the Water King rose from the depths. He was huge, with cold eyes that burned with anger. "You think you can stop me?" he growled. "I take what I want." His hand reached out for Lena, but Klaus stood in front of her, refusing to let go. "Not today!" Klaus shouted. The battle was only just beginning. Klaus and Lena struggled to escape the king's grasp. The water swirled around them, pulling at their feet. Then, just as things seemed hopeless, Wilfried appeared with a flaming torch. He threw the torch into the water, and the flame spread across the surface. The Water King hissed and pulled back. The fire seemed to weaken him. Klaus grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her away from the lake, but the king wasn't going down that easily. Wilfried explained that the only way to truly defeat the Water King was with a sacrifice. "One of us has to stay behind," he said. Klaus didn't want to let anyone go, but Wilfried stepped forward. "Let me take his place," he said. "I'll stay here. Take her away." The Water King reached for Wilfried, and with a final, loud scream, the fisherman was pulled into the water. Lena cried out, but Klaus couldn't do anything to stop it. Wilfried had saved them, but at a terrible cost. The lake grew still after that. Lena collapsed into Klaus's arms, still shaken but free from the king's hold. The sky above seemed calmer, and the wind stopped howling. They slowly made their way back to the inn, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The lake, once dark and terrifying, now looked peaceful. But Klaus couldn't forget Wilfried's sacrifice, and Lena couldn't stop thinking about the king that was now gone, for good. Klaus and Lena went back home, but they never forgot the Black Forest or the lake that almost took Lena. They still thought about Wilfried and the strange creature in the water. Klaus often wondered if the Water King was truly gone, or if he was waiting for someone else to take his place. Years later, Klaus and Lena returned to the Black Forest, older but still remembering their terrifying experience. When they came to Mummelsee, the lake looked the same, calm and still. But as they stood by the water, the wind picked up, and the faintest sound of a song reached their ears. They looked at each other, hearts racing. The legend of the Water King might not be over after all.